Hello, everyone. Um, Today we're going to talk about the network of Russian regional museums, quite specific one, and about the way they're constructing our gaze on certain events, landscapes, and um, societal particularities. And I'm going to start by representing the network itself, because I really think that it's important to know the place of the network in the market of creating historical narratives and working with memories in contemporary Russia. So the network I'm talking about, the network of Russian краеведческие regional museums, it's quite a specific one. You can see the pictures here of several museums, which are all scattered around post-Soviet spaces. And they come in all various shapes and forms. If you're not familiar with Soviet history, with Russian post-Soviet history, you would probably not believe that they belong to a unified network, but they do. And so these museums, they are really different in terms how they look, but they share quite a lot of them share common principles and common patterns of representation, which I think is very important to understand and to kind of approach in memory studies. So these museums were formed in 1920s, and their main idea, their main goal was to create a place identity. They used to act as the centers of local history research, local geographical studies, but as well, they were creating the identity of the place they were representing. And of course, in the beginning, when the network has just actually started to emerge, there were no rules and there were no kind of overarching idea what this museum should do and what should be the ways of representing the region. But starting from 1930s, the old network was taken over by Soviet authorities, unified and centralized, and specific guidelines on representation were issued, which were completely the same for the whole country. There was so-called regional component, but it was never actually, kind of said or written what it is about. But the way the place should be shown, should be kind of represented, what are the typical features of the place, that is something that was set in stone in these Soviet guidelines. And so despite the region, despite the special level museum was representing it, it might be from Yakutia, which is the largest region actually in the world, but in Russian context, well, for sure in Russia. And for a small village, Cherdyn, or Большая Atna in Tatarstan, or Lavrentia, it doesn't matter. There were a set of rules on how these events should be shown. And the golden system of representation consisted of three parts, which was geography, history, and society and culture. And those three parts remain in the majority of museums still today. So this is just, don't have to read it in the details. It's just something to give you an impression how these guidelines worked. So it was very strict idea what should be shown, what not should be shown. There were lists of artifacts and materials which should have proved the tolerance of the museum and of the people of the Krai of the region towards, Soviet state, the love, the patriotic feelings. And on the same themes, it's kind of as a production of the socialist portrait of this place. And when I'm saying that it's not only in relation to the history, but also in relation to the geography, and of course, in the relation to the so-called societal, historical, cultural, societal department, which used to be dedicated to the socialist present of a place. In fact, some of the museums quite often were showing showing something else. Quite often they were not following the guidelines very strict, but these are the exclusions, you know. The golden rule was that is how the socialist place should be constructed. Each department has very strict, like, kind of sub-departments, subtopics, sub-themes, which were aligned to the overarching Soviet narrative and Soviet view over history. The same true for, as I said, nature and geography, and kind of society, culture, socialist presence of the region. It has very, it was absolutely aligned with the predominant narrative and predominant debates in the discipline, in the academic discipline. So you can see a lot of from Marxist and Marxist-Leninist debates on the geography and on the, you know, environmental studies in the geographical departments and nature departments and so on and so forth. But the problem is that although we live in a completely different country right now, and the borders have changed, the places have changed, and the idea about the geography and history and culture have changed since 1930s. Those rules and those sets of approaches which constructed the socialist gaze haven't changed a lot. And that is due to that is because of the several factors, because краеведение, the discipline which is supposed to be leading the museum, right? Which is supposed to be the source of knowledge which is represented in the museum, has never been actually rethought critically, or nobody actually ever thought of creating new rules for these museums. So they kind of left to do whatever they want. They kind of have a certain level of freedom, for sure, from central government, from central governance, federal governance, and from regional as well. But in fact, they are actually recreating the same. They're creating the same place, reproducing the same place as they were doing in the Soviet times. I think, in fact, the last centralized decision that were made and that which affected the whole network was the Stalin's death and following set of rules which were imposed to take away the Stalin figure from the museum, at least partly. And so the general, it is really hard to say, when you talk about the network of more than 800 museums, it is really hard to work with empirical data, as you can imagine. But, you know, I think I have a sense what's happening right now in the network. So I can say that the majority of museums still reproducing the same socialistic image of the place as they were doing in 1930s and 1940s. It's the true for history, nature, and society. Although some of the topics and some of the places started to appear in the representation in 1990s, 2000s, but that is not a general rule. And in what will follow, I will just outline several directions, several interesting new kind of initiatives in the museums and tell them why they're actually not that critical as we want them to be. So in terms of history, it's always interesting to have a look how the museum work with the topic of the repressions. And I need to say that some of the regional museums, not all of them, of course, some of them start to include the topic of the repression in their expositions. But quite often it's just a small corner in, for example, the existing department of the social construction of the region, social present of the region, which is still there. You can see kind of new corner on Soviet repressions built in, like in Kalpashevo 2016 in the picture. Or, for example, as in Yakutsk, you can have a whole exposition dedicated to the victory in the World War II, which is actually not World War II, but the Great Patriotic War here. And and in this context, as you can see here on my slide, you will find one particular mount, one particular small section dedicated to actually Gulag in the region with the quotes from Solzhenitsyn. So you can see that it's actually not the archival research, or it's not based on some documentary materials, but it's rather just, you know, quotes from Archipelago Gulag. It's worse when we start to approach what is silenced, what is actually shown in terms of nature, because, as you know, there are a lot of discussions how history is being politicized, and, you know, what is the historical narratives and what should be remembered or not. But it's all true and for geography, because certain places, certain landscapes, certain certain events tend to be excluded from the representations and tend to be silent in the popular media, in textbooks, and in the museums. And so, you know, the typical picture of nature department and something like that, what you see right now, it's in between it's in between very very positivistic approaches to the nature. I would say, even, you know, from the point of view environmental determinism. It's all about how we can make what a man can make from the nature, what he can benefit from the natural resources, from the soils, from the vegetation. So it's all about that. It's very anthropocentric representations, and they lack a lot. You know, not to say that it's completely built. It's built completely on very old and not very relevant thoughts and ideas about the nature and geography in general. It is also exclude a lot of nice, interesting, and controversial landscapes, such as borderlands, cities, and other places which are, you know, which kind of which don't fit in this socialistic idea of how a place should be constructed or how geography should be shown. And of course, the same is for society departments today. And if you start to look if you start to examine the way the different ethnicities are represented, national minorities are represented, if you start to look from the colonial perspective on these representations, you would see that it's actually, you would notice pretty much the same. You would notice the construction of very colonial gaze. You would find a lot of objectivations and generalizations in terms of the life of national minorities. For example, this my favorite exposition on the Soviet presence in Chukotka, in Provedenia, one of the main seaports, Russian Soviet seaports in Far East, and they keep being reproduced still. And in my research, I was actually looking at these, artifacts on these modes and models of silences, which this representation are creating. So how the things are silenced, how the things are shown but not completely included in the discourse, because one of the favorite way of dealing with the Soviet repressions for the curators is actually to show the camp. There has been camps like in Berezniki, for example, but they completely forget to show the influence of the camp, on the town, on the city. And actually, Berezniki was a town which was completely built by the Gulag prisoners, and that is not said. That is not there. But we can't say and we can't claim that the camp was not mentioned at all. So they tick the box, but that's how far they get. And in my research, I worked with more than 40 museums, 45 museums across the country in 10 regions. And I found out that there are various ways and various methods of creating these silences, of working with patterns, the Soviet patterns of production of a place, but at the same time excluding quite the same. So what is shown actually predefine what is not shown and what is excluded. And so I have adopted the Barth's theory of myth making and mix it a bit with Svetlana Zboim's idea of the everyday life. And I came up with some of the methods which are used to exclude things in the museums, in the Krayevichesky specific museums today. I call that, we can call it silences. I call it common unsaids because I believe that the Krayevedenie as a form of knowledge is so popular that it's actually very, it's really a common knowledge for Russians. And so quite often I will just name some of them, and I'm very happy to discuss it further on our online event. But you can admit a part of an, you can do an collation, you can admit of parts of an evil, like Gulag. You can show a camp and exclude, as I said, exclude everything else. Just state the fact. You can disconnect the event completely from from its social and economical influence. You can do a bubble, and it's very close to first two methods that I mentioned. You can just forget about something and exclude, and it's very popular, for example, in nature departments when things are just excluded and not shown, the landscapes are not shown. Or you can state the fact, you can create a common knowledge, like, everyone knows, but with the methods of expositions. So this is what I wanted to share with you today, and just to get a sense of how the Soviet guidelines and the Soviet ideas on end of slides, yes. Soviet ideas of construction, it's too dark, I guess. The Soviet idea of how the things can be constructed and shown, and how the socialist place should be shown, can be seen today, and what this construction of a place predefines in terms of social and cultural silences, and what is finally not shown and do not get to our common knowledge. Thank you very much for listening to that.